this session. And also, if you look in your upper left-hand corner, there's an Otter AI live tab. And if you click on that, you can view the live notes. So it just kind of provides a transcription in case that's helpful to you if you'd like to access that to help you through the event. And so I would love to start by, if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat, just your name, where you're joining us from, and kind of how you're affiliated with Peabody. So you could just put that in the chat. And while we do that, I'd love to introduce our speaker for today. So happy to have Sarah Suter, who is Associate Professor of Practice in Human and Organizational Development and the Director of the Community Development and Action Master's Program. Dr. Suter's work engages community-based responses to promoting health and human health and well-being. She has conducted community-based research with health and human development organizations domestically and internationally, and is currently serving as the director of the Planning and Evaluation Core for the Meharry Vanderbilt TSU Cancer Partnership. And to interview her today, we have Kay Heffernan, who is a dual degree community development and action MED student and a Master of Theological Studies student from New Hampshire. Kay works as a research assistant for the SAMHSA-funded I Am Experience, an HIV prevention program based at Fisk University and led by Dr. Sandra Barnes. They also volunteer with Peabody's Career Services as a peer career mentor and organize a group for sober and recovery LGBTQ people in Nashville. And so I'm so excited to have you both here. Thank you for coming and being part of this. And I'm going to turn it over to Kay as the facilitator.
Great, thanks, Hasina. Just one little announcement before we get started. If you haven't already, if you could make sure that you've muted yourself. Of course, you know, I hopefully will have time to open the conversation up at the end, and you can unmute yourself then, but I think for the transcription purposes, if you could make sure that you have your mics off, then that would be really helpful. So yeah, thank you, Hasina, for introducing us both. Sarah, it's so good to see you. It's been a really long time. Sarah and I, when was the last time we saw each other? Maybe March, but it feels like even longer than that. And so I am a second year in the Community Development and Action Program, the program that Sarah leads and is the eternal goddess of, and I'm sure a lot of other people in my cohort and others would say the same thing. But today, Sarah and I think we're just gonna have a conversation as we would if we were in class or just passing and talking about the things that we are interested in. And so for the folks in the audience, things that we'll be talking about today are our own, probably our theories of change in terms of, well, what that is, first of all, and how we perceive ourselves as community engaged practitioners. And then also just sort of how we make sense of this chaotic world in a very, very, very chaotic time as people who are very deeply invested in caregiving, and feminist praxis. So yeah, hopefully that sounds good, Sarah. I'm sure this will take a lot of different forms too. But I have a bunch of questions, some of which you all have sent in to Hasina, others we've sort of come up with through some emailing back and forth. So I just wanted to start off, Sarah, with a really open-ended question, and I can narrow this down too, but what is your operative definition of community engagement? And this is for in light of your own practice and the many hats that you wear.
Yeah, that's a big question. And also, so just so people know, I'm so grateful for this beautiful new building that I'm in and the really beautiful sunlight that you see coming in behind me. But if it ever is like blinding, it looks a little blinding on my screen, tell me and I'll try to like move. Hasina, maybe you can tell me or something, I'll move somewhere else. So I thought maybe I would start and talk about kind of my first entree into community engagement, and then I could maybe say a little bit about sort of how I practice it and what it means to me. And so as an undergraduate student, I majored in psychology. I loved psychology. I thought I wanted to be a clinician. I had to, for my degree, I had to do some kind of internship in psychology. And so I had planned to intern in somebody's lab, like doing research one summer, and for a variety of uninteresting reasons that fell through. And so I was sort of scrambling at the last minute to find a sort of research internship. And a man who had graduated from my undergraduate institution, who had a PhD in industrial organizational psychology, sort of reached out to see if there were any people who were interested in interning with him for the summer. And what the internship was to act as an organizational consultant to the Cherokee National Government in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. And so Cherokee Nation is a 14-county jurisdictional area in the northeast corner of Oklahoma. And at the time, they were redesigning all of their government services. So they had sort of 4 divisions: community development, health and human services, education, and another one that I'm forgetting. Maybe health and human services were 2 different ones. I think that might be the case. But anyway, so I worked with the community development group, and sort of what the way that it worked was that the consultant that I was working for had gotten to know all of these people who lived at Cherokee Nation, who were sort of leaders in the community, and they were the experts in sort of what we were doing. And so Mark's job, my boss, and then my sort of job was mostly just to support him as an intern, was really about being a convener and bringing people together to redesign in this case, the services and the structures that affected them. And so there are a few things I'll say about that. The first thing is that the first 2 weeks that we were there, we took a history class that was taught, we took an American history class that was taught by Cherokees on their sort of Cherokee perspective of American history, which you probably don't have to reach too far to imagine was very different than what I had been taught in school. And that was it just was a great setup from the very beginning. The other thing is sort of what I've already said, is that I learned community engagement for the first time as a sort of a process of sort of asking the question of, what is my role in making sure that community, however you define that, are sort of people who are experts in their own lives. And then the last thing is that as I was sort of applying for the internship, I was talking to a group of Cherokee leaders who were sort of interviewing all of the people on the team to sort of make sure that they wanted us to come. And I said, if you could tell me one thing that you want me to know before I sort of, if I'm hired before I do this, what is it? And they said, come as a learner, not as a do-gooder. And I think about that a lot still, in part because I am totally a do-gooder. Like, that is my nature, is to like be a do-gooder. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that necessarily. Certainly it's much better to do good than to do harm, I think. But it really is about sort of a posture of humility, about sort of seeking to learn before you seek to change. And anyway, that, 20 years later, that's something that continues to resonate with me as I do community engagement. The other thing I'll say is just that I think community engagement looks very different in very different projects and processes. So as a student, I sort of did a lot of studying of community-based participatory research, which is the ideas that you're sort of involving again, the people who are affected by the phenomenon that you're studying at every stage in the process, like designing the research question, collecting data, analyzing data. And when I did my dissertation research, I sort of went in guns blazing, like, we're all going to do CBPR. And the community that I was studying, it was a recovery community for women. We're kind of like, okay, so we have jobs and we don't want to do your job, and research is your job. So we want to tell you what we want to know. We want to inform your research question. And then when you're done doing all your research, we want you to tell us what you're going to say before you tell anybody else. And so I say that to say, in that context, that was a very different form of community engagement than others. But I think it looks different, and being community engaged is being responsive, I think, to the context that you're in.
I love your answer to that. I think, something that I really took from my first semester at Peabody and NCDA was exactly what you were saying, right? The posture of a learner versus a do-gooder. I think that's how the program gets so many amazing, wonderful, justice-oriented people into it, right? We all want to change the world, but if we're going to be doing that alongside or in a community, we have to, right, work through practicing humility, and that, as you were saying, looks really different depending on the community you're working with. And so one of the questions that we received throughout the week, and maybe too as you were going through your dissertation process and in your research now, is do you have any like essential text, core text, or resources that have served as grounding guides to the work that you do?
Yes, so I actually made a list, and I'm going to find what I did with it so I can be sure and tell you. Okay, so I read a lot, and I read a lot of different things, and I read really slow, so I tend to read like 10 things at once, and then I can't remember what was where, which is maybe not a very good practice. But in response to this question, I think the first thing is what sort of grounds my work shifts a lot. And so I tried to think about what are some readings that have been important for me, like, for long enough of a time that they feel like sort of central. And so the first one I would say is Eve Tuck is, I actually don't know where she is, but she has written a lot that I really like, but she has an article called Suspending Damage. And she talks about the way researchers sort of frame, and she's really speaking to researchers who are interested in social justice. And she argues that one of the strategies that people use is to say, like, here's how unjust this system is. And as a result, it has created all kinds of harm among these people. And like, look how damaged these people are. And this is why we should change. And she really questions that, both as a theory of change. And so one is that an effective way to bring about change? But two, she sort of says, like, what's the consequence of thinking of ourselves as damaged? And so rather than damage-centered research, she recommends desire-centered research, which is really about sort of trying to figure out where are we trying to go, and then how can research help us in that process? And so that's one I love. Another article that I love, there's an article by Susan Kahn that I think is maybe 10 or 15 years old, called Come Out, Whatever You've Got. And then the other title is Or Still Crazy After All These Years. And probably the thing I like about it the most is that it is just like beautifully written and such a pleasure to read. But it's an essay by Susan Kahn, who's sort of does medical humanities, and she talks about her process of coming out as sort of a young person, and what a joyful that process that was. But then she talks about her process as an adult of coming out as a person with a chronic illness, and she talks about what a struggle that is, and what a struggle that has been, especially so she's an academic, and she writes about the context of sort of being sick, what she would say is sick and slow, in a context that honors productivity and lots of work. And I just think it's so smart, and it says a lot about what we think about health, and what we think about contribution, and what we think about responsibility. And so that's another one. I love Bell Hook's Teaching to Transgress. Just as as a doctoral student, I learned a lot about how to research, and I did not take advantage of the Center for Teaching at Vanderbilt University, which I would have done differently if I, were doing that now. But so I didn't really feel very equipped to teach, and tried to think a lot about, like, how do I want to teach? And that is a book that has been instructive to me in sort of thinking about Bell Hooks talking about why she teaches and how she teaches. And then the last one I'll say is that Eva Kate is I guess she's a political philosopher who has a daughter that has really severe disabilities. And so something that some of you know about me, but some of you may not, is that one of my children was born with pretty substantial disabilities and passed away when she was an infant. And so at that time, I really sort of adopted, and still in some ways adopted, the disability community as my own, and started doing a lot of reading. And so Eva Kate has this book called Love's Labor, in which she talks about her daughter who has profound cognitive disabilities, but has lived into adulthood. And I just think it's such a beautiful meditation on like what makes people human, and what we should want for one another. And anyway, it's great. So I could go on forever with this question, but I'll stop with those 4.
What's funny is this is making me think too of one of the first conversations that Sarah and I ever had, was me sort of going into your office and saying, what should I read? And so I can definitely recommend Eve Tuck as a very formative text, I think, for many community-based practitioners, but there are still some books you just recommended that I have not yet heard of. So thank you, with all the spare time, right, that everyone has here. But in sort of your reflections on these texts, there are so many, it seems like the way that you're drawn to these texts is through the way in which they depict relationships that either, get pressurized by systemic and structural constraints, or maybe normative senses of what it means to relate to people, the sense of morality that we might have, particularly as white folks too, and what we can learn from marginalized communities about liberating ways of relating. And so there were 2 questions actually that sort of come out of that, and we can maybe pick up whichever one seems most relevant. But one of the folks who wrote in asked, what is they said the most common attitude, perspective, or behavior you find gets in the way of optimal well-being? And I think we can probably talk a little bit about what optimal well-being might mean before we give an answer. But I don't know, what are your first thoughts hearing that question, Sarah?
Yeah, okay, so the first one is that I will say that I'm a perfectionist, and so my sort of inclination is to say perfectionism. But the more I thought about it, I thought, okay, maybe that isn't my response. And so I think I actually want to say something different, which is, as I said, I have also done research with this community of women that is a recovery community, and there's a lot to that. But one of them is that they sort of follow a 12-step model, and like essential part of 12-step model, as I'm sure many of you know, is being able to say when you're wrong and to apologize and ask for forgiveness. And that is really hard. I just want to say that's hard. And so I grew up in a very lovely family where no one would ever admit that they were wrong or apologize for anything. And that is like a really hard way to go through life, I think, just in general. And so I think apologizing is important on sort of an interpersonal level, because I think it helps restore relationships. I think it's important on an individual level because it's just a lot to carry if you feel like you always have to be right and you can never, sort of seek someone's forgiveness or even apologize. But I also think on a systemic level, how different things would look if we could have real conversations about these are the harms that I've helped create, or that I sort of benefit from a system that has helped create. This is how I feel about that, and what needs to be done to rectify that. And I think that we could really have very productive conversations about justice if there were sort of those rhetorical skills in our national conversations. So that's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say what gets in the way is not being able to admit when you're wrong, or sort of apologize and seek forgiveness, which are 2 different things. But when best practice, they go together.
Right. Yeah. I spent some of this summer and some of this semester learning from Meaghan Mundy, who's a disability justice activist, and someone who's really interested in transformative justice. And once she's like, if you're going to take anything away from this workshop series, it is we all cause harm and we all have been harmed. Right. And so I think, and you sort of, scratching your chin and saying that things might look a lot different if we all were able to really internalize this statement. I think I agree with you there. And that too sort of leads into this question about, as I had mentioned at the beginning, theories of change. So we are in the midst of a very confusing election season, a global pandemic, an uprising for racial justice against police brutality, and so many other things that are, really impacting our relationships with the world and with each other. And so I would love, Sarah, if you were able to just give a brief definition of what a theory of change is, and then if there has been a theory of change that is giving you hope through moving through this really confusing time.
Yeah. Okay. So it is worth saying that I do a lot of program evaluation. And so in program evaluation, theory of change is a very specific thing, which is like, we take these inputs, we do these activities, we have this evidence that we've done it, and then we hope that it accomplishes these outcomes. And so when I first read this question, when you sent it to me, I was like, okay, I don't think that's what she's asking. I need to like sort of back that up. But it really is, or at least I understand it to be sort of what is a theory about where we're going, how change happens to get there, and sort of what that process looks like, what kind of resources we need. And if, I don't know if you have something else you want to add to that or something different, but then
No, I think that's great. I mean, it's good to have the program eval specific definition too, because a lot of the people on this call will probably, encounter that at some point. But yes, just maybe in another sense, like a vision, mantra, something along those lines.
Yeah. And then, so I think the first thing that something that has been giving me hope recently is that I think in moments like these, it's so easy to feel like nothing has changed, or that like we're gonna keep in like 50 years, we're still going to be talking about police brutality because nobody's going to do anything. I think it is easy to sort of start to feel really sort of desperate and demoralized about the state of the world. And so one thing I'll say is that I was listening to this podcast recently, and they were interviewing Ezra Klein, who's a columnist for the New York Times, and they were asking him sort of like, what gives you hope? And he said, I've been at this long enough to know that things do change. And so he gave a few examples, all from sort of the Bill Clinton era. And he said, so one of them is, he said, if you look at Clinton's immigration policy, which at the time was so out, like people thought it was so left, it was so out there. And he said, if you look at it now, you just can't even believe how like racist and repressive it is. And he said, so, that is a way that I think things have really changed. And then he also cited Clinton's sort of policy on the military, which was on sexuality in the military, which was don't ask, don't tell. And he said, again, at the time that was like really out there for a lot of people. And he said, and now like, you can't, like that seems like such a gross policy. Like, don't tell us who you are, don't be yourself, hide whatever, And so anyway, so I think that is maybe one thing is that is sort of reminding myself of examples and having other people remind me of examples of ways that things have changed. And so one of my projects is that I work with the Vanderbilt TSU Cancer Partnership. And so there are people in the partnership. So Billy Ballard is an oncologist. I actually think he's a doctor and a dentist at Meharry. And he was, I believe, the first Black oncologist in the country. And he's kind of like, don't you dare say that things haven't changed, because I've been around long enough to know that they have. And so that's the first thing. And that's not a theory of change, but I think it is reminding myself of examples that things do change and things have changed. And, and so it's a possibility even when it feels like it isn't. And then the other thing is, so last year, Kay introduced me to Adrienne Maree Brown, and I've been reading Emergent Strategy, and I have found so much sort of like pleasure and hope from her work, and just the idea that in the work of social change, we should be finding joy. We should be giving people a positive vision of where we want to go, not just a negative vision of sort of where we don't want to be. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what comes to mind.
No, I love those thoughts. Too, that's in sort of bringing up Adrienne Maree Brown, I found that I've really drawn on, she has another book called Pleasure Activism, and the core text for her in that book is Audre Lorde's The Uses of the Erotic. And the number of times I have read that in the last year, in thinking about even the small decisions that helped me sort of piece together what I did yesterday and the day before, and sort of thinking about how, even though things are looking bleak, particularly with the change of the seasons and all of that, it's good to be able to turn inwards, right? And sort of find reassurance that through emergent strategy that we are sort of, hardwired in some ways, though we do need to be coaxed with that too. But in community, we're sort of hardwired to organize in a way that moves towards justice. And so I'm glad that you have enjoyed that book. There's she's quite an interesting person. If people on the call haven't listened to her read, she's really interested in that book about mushrooms and ways in which mushrooms and trees, talk to each other over miles and miles and miles underground, and the ways in which we might have seen that reverberated throughout history and organizing for liberation, abolition, things like that. But so many good things. So I'm wondering, now that you've mentioned your work with Thistle Farms and the Meharry TSU Cancer Partnership. So as you've started to reflect sort of on collaborations that you've had, what are some of the most memorable collaborations you've entered into as a researcher and program evaluator? And how do they shape your practices today? I know you've talked a little bit, but are there ones that either you want to add more on, or brand new experiences to bring into the conversation?
Yeah, so I'll talk just a little, well, I have a few different, anyway, I'll just start talking. So I mentioned this a little bit already, but so the Meharry Vanderbilt TSU Cancer Partnership is a 20-year partnership among the institutions that I just named. And so for people who don't have a frame of reference, for Nashville, Vanderbilt has a big medical center. They also have a very good cancer center that does, a lot of research, a lot of treatment. Meharry is a historically Black medical college. I think as late as 1980, they educated 50% of the Black doctors in the United States. And they have a dental program. I think they still produce the highest number of Black biomedical PhD scientists in the country, and they've been here for a long time, I think since the late 1800s. And then TSU is primarily an undergraduate institution, but it does have master's and doctoral programs, and it is also an HBCU. And so the goal of the partnership is really to bring together those three institutions and say, collectively, we care about health disparities in cancer, and we care about disparities in education of cancer researchers, and how can we address this collectively? And one of the things that I most appreciate about the partnership is, so a few things. One is that there's a real emphasis on sort of balance of power among the three institutions, among the different disciplines, right? So we have a community engagement core, we have a translational pathology core, we have a clinical trials core. And people work really hard to not let, for example, bench science be more important than community engaged science, or Vanderbilt to be a more important partner than Meaghan. And so there's a lot of emphasis on sort of balancing power among the institutions. But then the other thing I'll say is that, and I think this is a really important aspect of collaboration, is rather than everybody trying to do the same thing and all the things, everybody sort of like does what they're good at and uses that to facilitate the work of other people. And then we all sort of like celebrate each other's work and strengths. And that isn't to say that it's like always really, fun and happy and there's no conflict, but generally speaking, I think it's such a healthy collaboration and way of working, because it really is about people doing what they're good at, and sort of respecting and admiring what other people are good at as well. There are 16 other of these sort of sites around the country, and the Vanderbilt Meharry TSU one is the longest running, and people are very proud of that. I just want to sort of tell you that. So that's one thing, but then to sort of give people a little bit more information about Magdalen House, which now people call Thistle Farms. If you're a Nashville person, that's probably what you've heard. But it's a 2-year recovery community for women. Women live there for free. They have what would sort of clinically be called wraparound services. That's not what they call it. They have a social enterprise where women work. They have a cafe and a sort of bath and body company. And anyway, I wrote my dissertation about Magdalen House. I wrote an ethnography, which is the way that I love to work, but also the way that I almost never have time to work anymore, which I'm like, maybe when my kids are grown up, I'll do more ethnography. But I feel like I learned so many things from Magdalen, but the big thing I'll say is I was there for 2 years before I did any research. And so, which is, as a graduate student, you have that flexibility. So that's really nice. But I labeled candles and I talked to people, and one of the jobs, so this was not that long ago, but they sort of were not very up to date with technology. And so anytime they made sales, they had some of you are probably not even old enough to remember this, but you like put a credit card on a thing and you like go like that. And anyway, so I had to like one number at a time punch the like credit card numbers anyway, I just did random grunt work like that, but it was so important to my research. And something else that Adrienne Maree Brown says is that you have to move at the speed of trust. And so for a community like that, I think had sort of provisionally welcomed me as a researcher, it was crucial to my research that people felt like they could trust me. And that took a really long time. And a lot of work to not, it would have been so easy to damage it really quickly. And so I think, when I think about that project and I think about what I'm sort of most proud of, the sort of the relationships that I have, and then I haven't done research there in a long time, but have maintained a lot of those relationships, is something that I'm really proud of. And I think allowed me to do really good research that sort of reflected the community. So, and also when Kay emailed me, she said, memorable collaboration doesn't necessarily have to be good collaboration. And I do actually have this really terrible story, but I don't know how to tell it without kind of like outing the organization that I was collaborating with. So I'll tell you another time in a less public space if people really want to know.
Yes, I definitely think that should be an important, not disclaimer, but just a truth to understand that in any sort of community-based research, work, development, partnership, whatever you're doing, you're working with people who are, chronically underfunded, usually facing a lot of other challenges that are part and parcel of the nonprofit industrial complex if you're working there. But right, I mean, any sort of work with the humans about social issues will be complicated. The personal is political, as they say, but you know, sometimes it's just as frustrating as folks not returning your emails or that sort of thing. So, you know, that happens. And I think, as you said, Sarah, it takes just a lot of time, right, to show someone that you're willing to be flexible, you're able to be trusted, and you're generous with what you're expecting, anticipating, hoping to learn from a community and really anyone you're working with. And so, yeah, I too can attest to how much of a rock star Sarah continues to be over at Thistle Farms. And it's definitely a place, if any of y'all are based in Nashville or are going to come to visit, planning to move, have just moved here, when it is safe to do so or in a safe way, definitely go check it out, because they are some of the nicest people you will meet in Nashville. Let's see. Lots more questions. Maybe we'll just change it up for a second before delving into some harder things, though this may not be an easy question to answer. Someone wrote, any suggestions on applying for a PhD?
Yes, sure. So the first thing I'll say, especially if you're a current master's student, but it also looks like there are a lot of prospective students on here, so I'm so excited about that. But okay, so the first thing I would ask yourself is, do you need a PhD to do what you want to do? And I think that's a really important question, especially if you're a master's student in an academic environment. At some point, you will get the point, you will sort of receive the message that you should get a PhD. And that's because, like, people, I don't know, it's like, I have a PhD, and then, you know, you sort of like try to create people in your own image, and which is, you know, not, you know, anyway. So, but that's the first thing. Do you need a PhD? And maybe you don't to do what you need to do. But if you really do, I think, you know, I think a really good piece of advice, and something, at least in our admissions process, that we kind of sniff out pretty quickly, is that a PhD degree is a research degree. And so we want to know that you've done research, one, because we want to know that you have those skills, but even more importantly, because we want to know that you like it and that it's important to you and that it's something that you see yourself doing longer term. And so gaining research experiences, making sure that it's something that you like is really important. The other thing I would say is that I'm kind of trying to think about our own process a little bit with admissions. And so, but another one is being really sure that you understand the program that you're applying to, and what it is and what it isn't, and being able to express in your statement or any kind of interviews how you fit with the program, and sort of being able to demonstrate that you really understand what the program is and what they're trying to accomplish, and that is something that you sort of both would benefit from and contribute to. Something that I will say is that our department tends not to do like a direct mentorship or like an apprenticeship model. And so I can't really speak to programs like that, which might have sort of different rules. And so if there are other people on the call, Hasina or Dwayne, I don't know, or I'm trying to think of other people who are on here. If anybody else has, Nina, if there are other people that have other tips, feel free to jump in.
Sarah, I'm on here. So okay. Tips, was it tips for doc or tips for masters?
For doctors, for applying to PhD programs.
Yeah, I guess I would just echo that, which is like, do you really need a doctorate? Because you can have a lot of impact quickly with a degree that is A, faster, and B, potentially cheaper, although that's a mixed bag in terms of what kind of support you can get at the doc level versus master's level. But and I think for me, thinking about you know, our child studies masters or Sarah, you know, really matching what you want to do to where it is you want to go, and whether that's a master's level or a PhD. There's also, I think people are afraid sometimes if they don't just jump into a doc, they never will. I think that might come from the external voices in our heads. But there's always time to do what you want to do. And what I love is that, you know, if you can, take your time and be intentional and really do the thing that gives you, you know, joy and passion. And if it means you do it in a couple steps and work and get some experience, I love people who have experience and are really going back because they have a reason, a real grounded reason that the degree is going to, you know, help them further their cause, rather than there's nothing wrong with this, but rather than a sort of, oh, I want a master's or oh, I want a doctorate. So I just say, really probably echo what you do. Just make it worth your time and your money. And we and Sarah and Dwayne and everybody are here to help you make good decisions.
Yeah, I would echo that, but I would also say that also be prepared for where the journey leads you. I think that's one of one of our sayings in EDI and Office of Student Engagement is I thought I would go into research and academia after getting my PhD, actually in community research and action, and but had this opportunity to work in the dean's office in equity, diversity, and inclusion, and have loved being able to transition in this way. So I think both being trying to find the places where you fit and how it might fit into your journey, but also being open to opportunities that arise. I think, like Sarah, with opportunity with the Cherokee Nation, you never know how it's going to change your trajectory. And so I think it's a combination of those two things.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, you know, you might come in saying, I got to do X, but be willing to do Y, or just be open to it. And then sometimes I love watching these magical journeys that people take. It's like, hey, do you remember a couple of years ago when you wanted to do this? And now look at you. And those are really exciting. I agree. Just staying open and getting involved like Sarah has in a wide variety of things. You just never know what's going to spark your passion.
I'd love to jump in here too. I'm Meaghan Mundy, and I'm our Assistant Dean of Student Engagement and Wellbeing. And I would echo what Hasina and Nina are saying. I just had a conversation this morning with our graduate assistant, and she asked about, I have 3 degrees from Peabody, so I have a master's in the Human Development Counseling program, and my doctorate is in Leadership and Policy Studies. And she said, well, how did you know that you were going to do all those things and that you wanted to go in that direction? And what I told her, and what is my mantra, is follow the energy. And so for me, each time there was something that led me to that next right step. So for my master's degree, I happened to do an internship my senior year as an undergraduate that led me to knowing what I wanted to do in my master's degree. And as I did my master's work, an assistantship that I had led me to my next experience, which then led me back to get my PhD at Peabody. So it's really about kind of opening yourself, like Nina said, to being curious and staying open. And for me, about following the energy to each next right thing. So thank you.
I'd also like to echo that really quickly. I'm Sydney. I'm a CDA student. I'm a first year, and I'm in Sarah's class, actually, her pro seminar. And everything y'all are saying is very, very accurate, especially in terms of following which opportunities you have, because I actually originally applied for the PhD program in the CRA program. And thankfully, well, I was not admitted to that, but I was admitted to the master's program. And guess what? Turns out the master's program is a far better fit for me. And I am so eternally grateful and lucky to be in this program. I'm just going throughout this semester and imagining what it would have been like for me to start as someone who graduated undergrad 2 years ago and has been working, and especially after COVID pandemic, I'm trying to hypothesize what it would have been like if I had entered a PhD program in this semester. That thought alone gives me anxiety. That thought alone. And so, yes, I have a long way to go in terms of this program, and this is only our first semester, but the difference in terms of PhD versus master's is something to really look into. And it's on the receiving end, if there are any prospective students here, it's really easy to think about the academic elitism side of it, as in, I am only important if I have this PhD, or I am not as important if I only have a master's, and that's not true. You can write anything you want. You can go into research at any point. If you make those connections and you do the work and you have the ideas, your worth is not going to be dependent on whatever degree that you have at the end.
Yeah, thank you everyone for chiming in. I would also just say, sort of given some of the things that Sarah and I have been talking about in this conversation, that the academic elitism that Sydney mentioned, particularly if you are in the Community Development and Action Program or the Community Research and Action Program, Sarah said it so nicely, right? Like the humility that sort of is required to do good work alongside folks who have been doing good work, right? Just because you have a degree of whatever stature or none at all doesn't mean that you are not, living an adequate life that a human could live, right? And so I think that what Sydney is saying is really key. And if you are a prospective student, it is always helpful to reach out to folks, and it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to take up that space. I think most of the people you would probably email, at least on this call, would be really, blunt with you and saying, I have time for a phone call, or I have time for an email, but not a Zoom call, right? I think we're all pretty good with our boundaries. And so maybe for the folks who are at Peabody and feel comfortable being contacts for prospective students, if you want to put your email or your preferred mode of contact in the chat, if you want to make yourself available in that way, I will do that. So please feel free and reach out. And then the last thing I'll say too is what Meaghan had mentioned about following the energy. I am currently at the Vanderbilt Divinity School, and I never would have imagined that would be in my life in 100 years. And I am so grateful to have picked up on the cues that were all around me. So I think a few of us too can sort of speak to learning how to be aware of your surroundings and making decisions that bring that erotic out of you, to use sort of Lauren's term. Cool. Okay, there is a question in the chat, and we have about 10 more minutes, so I'll throw it out there. And I don't know if this is directed at anyone, so I'll just read it. And then if anyone wants to chime in, they can. But Elena writes, within the CDA program, what value might you all see in students who apply to the program straight out of undergrad? I am wondering if a student with little professional experience would add to the program's community. Yes, definitely. What are your all's thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I would say, in terms of applicants and people who are admitted, we have a group of people who are straight out of undergrad, a group of people who've worked for 2 or 3 years, and then we have a smaller group of people who have worked for longer before they sort of come to CDA. And I hope that we sort of practice within the program what we want people to practice when they get out of it, which is that if you are admitted and we sort of want you to be here, then it's our job to find a way for you to contribute in a productive way. And so I say that to say, like, different people bring different strengths, and people who come straight out of undergrad bring certain kinds of sensibilities and strengths that are valuable to the program. People who've been working for a few years bring other sensibilities and strengths that are valuable to the program. And so I think especially the question about, do you have something, let me see what it was, what you would add to the program's community, I think that you would have all kinds of things to add from your own personal life, from what you want the world to look like, from your experience as a student. I do think it tends to be beneficial, at least in terms of just kind of knowing, and you definitely don't need to know where you're going, but I do find that, especially for CDA, although I would suspect this is true of other Peabody programs, that being self-directed in your own learning is a really critical skill, both as a master's student and a doctoral student. And so I think having enough of a sense of, like, okay, I'm definitely not interested in that. I might be interested in these 5 things, but that kind of thing. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of my thought on that.
Sarah, there's another question in the chat from Danny. Any tips on what you're looking for from a personal statement or statement of purpose? This might sort of tag along with that previous question, and this is particularly for a master's level program.
So, and again, Nina, if you want to jump in here, I would love to hear what you have to say too, from sort of your perspective. From CDA, so this is funny, is one of my brothers is in college, is finishing his undergraduate degree as a 35-year-old and is interested in applying to master's programs. And so he emailed me like 2 days ago. He's like, okay, when you read these statements, what do you look for? And anyway, so I just thought about this for my brother's benefit a few days ago. So I would really say I look for three things in the statement. So the first one is writing ability, and that doesn't mean like, you're like a professional writer, but it does mean that you can communicate clearly. And so I think if writing is something that you need a little, work on or help with, that definitely having people read your statement and giving you feedback is a really good strategy. The other thing is that I look for, I think I said this a little bit already, but do you understand what the program is, and are you able to articulate how that will help you accomplish your goals? And so, sort of demonstrating that you really kind of have a grasp of what we're trying to do. And then the other thing is, I think anything that's sort of, so in the best possible world, things that help us remember you, right? And so, my brother was like, that's the part that is scary. Like, how do I express that without just, seeming totally silly? And so again, like, don't go over the top with it, but something that helps us sort of know what makes you unique, what makes you stand out. And those things tend to be, at least in my experience, people's lived experience, and or the types of sort of work that people have done. And that's something I'll say that I really love about CDA, is that I just think that the students are so interesting. And so Kay and Sydney, I hope that you all feel that about your cohort mates, because I certainly do.
Yeah, I was going to see if I could piggyback off of that for a moment, for coming from the student perspective, because I did just apply within the last year. And I think the biggest thing with grad school applications is, of course, anxiety. And if you had this experience going into undergrad, going on to forums and checking in with other people and having that anxiety of seeing who's getting accepted and what are their credentials, drop that. Just drop that. If you're a prospective student, just drop that for a moment. I know it's very hard. Try your best, but it's a bi-directional relationship when you're entering a graduate program of whatever nature. You want to make sure that, yes, you're conveying who you are and why you're passionate about the things that you're passionate about, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that department in particular is going to be a good fit for you, and that's okay. It's like any relationship. It's not about whether or not someone is good enough or not good enough. It's more so about the fit together. And so for my friends and I, writing our personal statements became much more enjoyable, going off of pleasure activism and just doing things for joy. The personal statement became less daunting when I started viewing it as something that I get to do. Like, I have the privilege of applying to graduate school. I have the privilege of letting people know why I am the way I am and who I am and why I really want to do the things that I want to do with my life. So, like Sarah mentioned, of course, check in with your writing ability and grammar and word choice and the pragmatic things like knowing what the program entails and if you're a good fit. But for the content, give yourself a break. Try your best to breathe and view it as something that you get to do and you want to share with other people how special you find yourself, and you want to make sure that they're also able to recognize how special you are.
So I am looking at the time and it looks like we have, yes, I was just going to ask for one more call for questions. So thank you, Raymond. Okay, so this looks like it's going to be our last question. And this is a great one. I feel like I definitely have some thoughts here, but also I only know my cohort. So Sarah, but also anyone else who is, CDA CRA affiliated, I'd love your thoughts on this. Is there one skill, commonality, or trait amongst the students in the CDA program?
So Kay, I want to know what you would say.
And so I really think this is a cohort specific answer. But also as a peer career mentor and getting to know this new cohort, I think a skill that you don't necessarily have to have perfect, and you don't have to be like on it all the time, but being able to ask really good questions, I think, is a really big piece of succeeding in CDA. And by succeeding and just like really taking up the space that you deserve to take up in a graduate program. And so for some people, that means asking about why you're learning what you're learning, hopefully not in a super belligerent way, right? But in saying, what is an end goal here, in asking yourself and your peers, what experiences do we share? What experiences do we not share? And where do we find that common ground? Maybe that feels like a little bit of a cop-out answer, but I really think that CDA students do a really good job at asking context-specific, compassionate, AKA like they're willing to receive a complex and confusing answer with grace, and just really intriguing questions. Yeah, that's what I would say.
I love that answer. I think that is a great answer. And I don't know who told me this, but at some point in my development, somebody told me it's way more important to asking the right question is like the thing, and maybe there's not a right question, but asking good questions. The other thing I would say is that CDA questions, or CDA students across the board, tend to see the world and want to make it better somehow. And what better looks like is different for different people. The strategies to accomplish that is different for different people. And I think that adds to a lot of richness. It also sometimes adds to conflict because, you want to go here and I want to go there. And so, but I think on the whole, people really care about, kind of what the world looks like, and if people are able to flourish in it, and think that it is problematic when that doesn't happen. So that's a great question.
That's a fabulous question. Thank you, Raymond. I feel like that's actually a really good place to end. And so, Hasina, I'll turn it to you if you want to wrap up, or I can do that. Not sure how these things go.
Well, thank you so much. And we're right on to, you guys did such a wonderful job. I don't know how you timed it to end it right at 1, but that is fantastic. Appreciate everyone who joined us. And if you do have questions, there's a lot of, I recommend copying the chat. We copied the names of the books that you guys recommended and some other resources in there. And please do reach out to us if you are prospective students. I think everybody here would be happy to respond and to talk further. And thank you for your comments, Nina. Yeah, thank you for joining us. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Our next faculty FaceTime will be with Eve Rifkin, who is the program director for the online EDD program, Leading and Learning Organizations. We have a lot of acronyms at Peabody, so it's the LLO program. So I'm excited to have her. She will be on November 6th. And so until then, we're so happy to see you and hope you have a wonderful weekend. Take care.